In our next couple of videos, we're going to look at the business intelligence and data analytics process by comparing it to related processes. So when it comes to data analytics and business intelligence are part project management and part business analysis and part information systems. And so as we look at these different processes, let's keep in mind a couple of data analytics examples. So perhaps we are analyzing data as part of our operations management. So let's suppose you're a grocery store and you want to track which meat needs to be removed from the grocery store shelves. Because we find that when meat loses its color, when it no longer looks appetizing, then people not only don't want to buy it, but they're kind of turned off from buying other meat as well. So we want to remove from the grocery store shelf any meat as soon as it's no longer palatable. Another example of data analytics is maybe we're doing some research in psychology and we want to quantify the impact that Instagram is having on mental health. And a third example, perhaps we're in finance and we're trying to predict stock values. So let's keep these examples in mind as we look at different parts of the data analytics process as they tie to other processes. So let's start with project management. Project management is the process of going through a project from start to finish. The parts of project management include initiate, so starting the project, plan, what are we going to do for this project, executing, what are we actually doing it, and then we have control, where we are monitoring how well it's going, and then we finish the project or we do closure. So when you initiate the project, you need a reason. Why are we doing this project at all? What are we trying to accomplish? What problem are we trying to solve? And we develop a plan, typically in the form of a project charter. So a project charter is going to consist of what is included in the project. So we start with a scope, and the scope identifies what is in the project and what is not. So we're creating some clear lines to create clear expectations as to what happens with this project. And then we have objectives. How will we know if the project is successful? So objectives are not steps in the process, but they're how we're going to measure the success of the project. So for example, with our trying to identify meat and remove it from the shelves, we could set a scope that we are going to capture and analyze using a webcam, analyze images. There's lots of ways you could identify when meat needs to be removed from the shelves and create processes for that. We could have people monitor, we could set up time periods after every couple days, then the certain items get removed. So we're going to specify that it's not those things, that instead we're going to create this image capture system and identification system. So that's what's within the project. And how will we know if that project is successful? Well, if it can actually identify rancid meat, and if it can notify managers that the meat is rancid so that they can remove it, then this project will be successful. Then we have what are called milestones. Milestones are deliverables with dates attached. So these are more of the steps in the process and when we expect them to be completed by. So we need to train our data and then test how well the algorithm works. So we could create a date as to which that is happening. And what we're doing is we're developing an algorithm. And so we're going to improve that algorithm so that when we test it, it performs better. It's able to identify more and more rancid meat, higher probability of correct identification. So we would have a deliverable of having that tuned algorithm and a date attached to it. Then we need to set up a webcam system. So when's that happening? And we want to create a notification method to let the manager know that meat needs to be removed. So milestones are these lists of deliverables. What are we going to actually do or create? And the dates that are attached to them. When you do a project charter, we've talked about what's in and what's out and how we'll know if our project is successful. We also want to do a risk analysis to determine what is likely to impact the success of our project. So what's going to put the project at risk? What's the probability that it's going to occur? And if it does happen, how bad is it going to be? What is the impact? And then we need to create some kind of contingency plan. How are we going to go about mitigating that risk? So for example, at our grocery store, maybe the challenge we have with this project is that there may not be enough images of good meat and bad meat to train and then test. Maybe we're not too concerned about it. We think the probability of it happening is only 20%. We think we can get lots of pictures of meat over the next couple weeks, good and bad, in the grocery store. Now, if we don't have enough images to train and then test, then the impact is, we think, about 70%. So it's problematic because if we don't have enough data, then it's not going to be a very accurate algorithm. Okay. But we have a contingency plan. Our contingency plan is that we are going to generate data using AI. So maybe we're going to use Midjourney to create images of good and bad meat, and then we can feed that into our algorithm. Another risk is lack of deployment knowledge. So maybe we're concerned that the people at the grocery store may not know how to create a system that automatically notifies the manager when the algorithm identifies a rancid meat. So the probability, we think, of not having enough knowledge is about 60%. If we don't have enough knowledge, then the impact is quite severe. We can't actually deploy it without this knowledge. So the impact is 90%. We need a contingency plan. How are we going to deal with that? So maybe our plan is we're going to hire a college student who can help with deployment, who has that knowledge. So a project charter, what's in, what's not in, how will we know what's successful, what are the steps and when are they going to happen, and then what are the risks to success and how will we reduce the risks we'll have on our success. When we do a project charter, we often have a couple graphs or tables, charts in our project charter. We have a work breakdown structure, a racy matrix, and a Gantt chart. So let's just take a look at these. Let's start with the work breakdown structure. So the work breakdown structure is kind of a flow chart here that shows the deliverables and activities and how they tie together. So we have at the top the project itself, which is to have this meat monitoring system. Now, everything that appears in this work breakdown structure needs to be within the scope of our project. So remember, our project was going to be about capturing images and analyzing images here. And then as we look at our work breakdown structure, these are, if we just go back, the deliverables that we had before, and then we break those deliverables down into activities. So we had deliverables related to testing and training data, and developing an algorithm. And then we had deliverables related to our webcam system and notifications. So we can bundle those first couple deliverables together into a machine learning model. We're going to collect the data. We're going to train the model. And when we train this model, we are going to have data that's labeled as to rancid meat and good meat, and so that it can start to learn what is good meat and what is bad. And then what this should say at the bottom is test the model. And so we can then put in front of it new images to see if it's able to identify whether the meat is good or bad. So all these tied to that machine learning model that we're developing. So notice that this work breakdown structure does not include the objectives, how we will know the project is successful, but it all should tie to the objectives. So our objectives, how we will know our project is successful, is that if we had an image detection system that identifies rancid meat. So here, this ML model is helping us to identify rancid meat, collect the data, train the model, and then it should say test the model. And then we have other deliverables related to deployment. So we're going to set up the webcam and build that notification system. And these tie to the objective that we had before, which is that the system is going to notify the manager when the product needs to be removed. So we create a work breakdown structure to show the deliverables and activities and how they tie to the overall project. that they are within the scope, and we want to make sure they relate to the objectives. Now we want to know who is responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted and informed. So we build what is called a racy matrix by taking the deliverables and activities that are in our work breakdown structure, and we identify people to go with them. So a racy matrix is your personnel, and then those deliverables or activities, and then we assign who is responsible, who is accountable, who is consulted, and who is informed. So for example, when it comes to collecting data, we have that Maria is going to do the actual collection of the images. And so Maria is responsible. Responsible is the doer. And you can have many people who are responsible for doing. So you might have multiple R's. Now, accountable, this is the person in charge. So for collecting data, Tina is going to be accountable. So Tina is the one who gets blamed if this doesn't get completed. You should only have one A per activity, one person who is ultimately accountable. So you can have multiple R's, but you should only have one A. Now, you can have someone be both responsible and accountable. So we can see here that when it comes to webcam setup, Shane is both the doer and the person who is in charge. Now, you can see here that every activity doesn't have everyone involved. So, for example, when it comes to training the model, Maria is doing the training, and Tina is the one accountable, and Shane is not involved at all in that process. And when it comes to the webcam setup, Maria and Tina are not involved. So every box in the racy matrix does not need to be filled. Now, the other pieces we have here are consulted and informed. So when we talk about consulted, a person who is consulted is providing information to those who are responsible and accountable. So perhaps when it comes to collecting the images, Shane is consulted. So Maria and Tina contact Shane and ask for input as to what kind of images would be the most effective. So the consultant provides the information to the responsible and the accountable. Informed is when the responsible or accountable provides information to that person. So Shane, you can see, is in charge of really the deployment process, the webcam setup and the notification. So he needs to be informed as to when the algorithm is ready to go. That means that Maria and Tina will tell Shane that the algorithm is at a certain percentage accuracy as they test the model. So our racy matrix is who is involved in the deliverables and activities, who is responsible, so who's actually doing it, who's accountable, so who's in charge. Remember, there's just one accountable per activity, who is consulted, and who is informed. The last item here that we'll look at including in our project charter is a Gantt chart. And the Gantt chart shows what activities will be done and when. So we can see how long it will take, or how long we assume it will take as we're planning our project, how long it will take to collect the data. So perhaps we think that it'll take about 2 weeks to collect all the images of good and bad meat. And then we're going to train the data. So that's going to take a week. And then we'll start doing our testing to see how accurate the model is. So our Gantt chart shows how long we expect to train and test. And you can see here that they're occurring after each other, suggesting that there's some precedence, that there's an order to this. What we can also see on this Gantt chart is that we can work on setting up the webcam while the training and testing is happening. So figuring out where to put the camera, what angle, protecting the privacy of our grocery store customers at the same time, all of that's being figured out while the training and testing is happening. Now, we can't actually deploy the system, though, until we've collected, trained, and tested. So you can see the deployment doesn't happen until week 4, and then we've set aside 2 weeks to get the last part of our project in place. So we've initiated the project by coming up with the reason for the project. We have done our planning by putting together our project charter. And then the next part is to execute, to actually do the project. And this includes scheduling, so who is going to work when, putting that Gantt chart and that racy matrix into effect, and some job sequencing. So if we have multiple people working on multiple things, then we need to know the order that they're doing that in. So this is the actual implementation. Then as we get further into the project, we need to look at control. So assessing how well the project is going. When we assess the project, we look at quality. So are we accomplishing what's needed? Are we meeting our objectives? Are customers satisfied, depending on what we're doing for this project? What is the cost? Are we still within budget? And what is the time? Are we on schedule? So we can go back to the Gantt chart, for example, and compare what we planned to how much time things are actually taking and where we are in the process. The last step is closure. So who needs to be informed when the project ends? So we need to do some reporting, maybe some documentation about the work that was done and how well that it went. Do we need to inform any particular bodies that we're accountable to, stakeholders, ethics boards if we're doing research, that the project and data collection is finished? So when it comes to that control phase, before we wrap up, we need to be able to assess how it's going. So to do a control while the project is still in effect, as opposed to just looking at the end in terms of were we on time and did we meet the budget, we want to monitor our progress and effectiveness during the project. So we create what is called a balanced scorecard. A balanced scorecard takes our objectives, how we would know if our project was successful, and converts them into key performance indicators. So how are we actually going to measure those objectives? So we need something that is actually measurable, and we need something where we can measure progress. So it's not just deployment, yes or no. How do we measure that we're getting closer and closer to the finish line? Then when it comes to our KPI, we need a goal. So what are we trying to accomplish in a time period? And then how far are we to that goal to date? We can then find our score, which is our KPI to date divided by the goal. That gives us a percentage. And the idea with the score is that a higher score is better. So we want to show that we are getting towards the goal by going from, say, 50% to 60% to 70%. That's why our KPI can't be something that's all or nothing. Did you complete this step or not? Because then we can't measure progress, and otherwise our score is just 0 or 100%. So we want something where we can measure that we're going. The other thing is that our score higher is better. So we want to make sure that what we're measuring, a higher KPI, is a better number. So for example, if we were doing a project and we wanted to make sure that nobody was injured in this project, maybe there's quite a bit of risk, physical risk in the project, you wouldn't want your KPI to be 0 injuries. Because the problem is while your goal is 0, if your KPI to date was 5, you would be 5 divided by 0, and you're at 500%. Does that mean that it's good? No, because you wanted 0 injuries and you have 5. So we often, when we have things like this where we want to have less is better, we'll do things like days without injury. The goal is to go the whole year, 365 days without injury. And if we make it, let's say 100 days, then we have an injury, 100 divided by 365, you can see that we're less than a third of what we wanted. So we want higher scores to be better. We want a KPI that measures progress. So let's take a look. So if we're talking about our meat example, we want to detect rancid meat. And we're building an algorithm related to that. So we're going to create this data, right? Our testing data, our training data, and we're going to create the algorithm and tune it. So we want to measure how well that algorithm is doing by percent of rancid meat correctly identified. Right now we are correctly identifying 50%. We know that 100% identification is probably not possible. The goal is 90%. So 50 divided by 90, our score right now is 55%. Notice the KPI to date and the goal are just numbers. The actual KPI column explains what that number is. So in this case, it's percent of rancid meat correctly identified. Now we had another objective, which was the system notifies the manager. So how many notifications do we have? We're measuring the success of this based on the number of notifications the manager has received. Well, to date, the manager has received 2 notifications. We want the goal to be about 20. We're 10% of the way there. So you can see how we can move that KPI to date can get higher, closer to the goal. That makes the score go higher. And our mean performance is how well we're doing overall on the project. And so it's just the average of the scores. So we take 55% plus 10%, divide by 2, we get 32.5. Okay. So before we leave this topic here about project management, take a moment and practice the project management process for the Instagram research project. What's the reason for the project? What are some of the components of the project charter? So can you come up with the scope, the objectives? Can you come up with some milestones? So that includes the deliverables. We could attach some dates to them. Can you come up with some risks and the probability and the impact and some contingency plans to help reduce that? So pause the video, see if you can come up with that, and then let's look at an example. So perhaps the focus of your research project is to observe Instagram use and survey families and interview children aged 6 to 15 regarding the impact of Instagram. So we're doing a longitudinal study here where we're going to track children over time and their corresponding families. So the objectives here are going to be to compare mental health benchmarks based on family assessment, based on child self-reporting, when they're young, before they start even knowing what Instagram is, and then during the child's use of Instagram. So we're going to collect information from the family, from the child, about their perceptions about themselves, about their child. Throughout this process, we're also going to analyze the Instagram usage by the children 6 to 15. So what are some deliverables? Well, this includes children in this research. It's mental health. There are a lot of research ethics considerations here. And so the first step in our process is to collect some research ethics approval. Then we need to recruit participants. We need to survey families. We need to interview children. And of course, those processes will repeat over time. So they are going to appear multiple times in our milestones so that we'll have dates attached to each of those deliverables. Then we have risks. What are the risks associated with doing this project and the success of this project? So we might not get enough participants. We think the probability is, let's say, 20%. And the impact on the overall study, maybe it's fairly low because we can then just change our analysis method. We were looking for a bigger sample size to allow for a certain type of analysis, but if it's a smaller sample size, then we'll change our methodology that deals more with small samples. Maybe the issue here is the access to Instagram data. So we think we can get families to participate and they will fill out surveys and do interviews, but the actual access to the Instagram data specific to these people might be problematic. So maybe the probability is about 30%. But the impact is quite big at 80% because if we don't have that data, then we can't do analysis on what they are seeing and doing in Instagram. And so the contingency plan is to reduce the scope of the project. And so we would remove that second objective and simply look at the family assessments and the child reporting from the questions that we ask. So you can see here that a research project follows the project management process. Let's just go back. We need a reason for the project. We need to plan. And then once we have that plan in place, we would then do that, execute it. And of course, we would do an assessment as we were going in terms of quality. Are we able to collect data and the information we're looking for? How are we doing in terms of cost and time? And then the closure aspect where we look at who needs to be informed that it's ending. And here we have the research ethics board that would be involved. And so they would be notified as part of that closure. We could do an assessment of how well the project is going. So we have our balanced scorecard here. our objectives where we compare mental health benchmarks. So we're going to need a number of participant families. Maybe our goal is to have 100, and currently we've recruited 23. So you see the KPI to date and goal are just numbers, and the KPI column tells us what those numbers are. So number of participant families, and the score here is 23%. We want to analyze Instagram usage by children as they progress from 6 to 15. So how many number of years of data have we collected? We've been in this project, let's say, for 3 years. We're collecting 3 years worth of data, but our plan is to track them from age 6 to 15. So there's 9 more years to go. Our project is 33% complete in terms of collecting the Instagram data. Our overall performance here, we can see, is about 28%, averaging those 2 scores. So we can look at our progress and how well we are accomplishing those objectives. And remember, the objectives are how we will know if our project is successful.